Everywhere you look on the internet, the consensus is pretty clear. There are no great white sharks in the southern Antarctic Ocean. It's just too cold for them. The Antarctic Ocean sits within the Antarctic Circle, an imaginary line found at 66 degrees and 33 seconds south in latitude. It encompasses much of the icy continent itself and a few outlying islands here and there. But just outside that circle, there's some other islands, known as the subantarctic islands. South Georgia is one of them, littered with hundreds of thousands of king penguins and elephant seals, and boasting a brutal climate only suited to the hardiest of marine animals. But another one of these subantarctic islands is Campbell Island. This isolated, rugged patch of rock is officially classified as New Zealand's most southerly island, sitting about 430 miles south from the mainland. It's got a cold and windy climate and rains pretty much constantly for 325 days of the year, meaning it's not particularly high on the list for Kiwi holiday goers. Today it's uninhabited by humans, but that wasn't always the case. Campbell Island has a long history of sealing and then later whaling in the 1800s, but in more recent history, it was once a meteorological station where scientists lived for up to a year at a time, conducting research on the weather, climate, and the island's flora and fauna. And during this brief period of human habitation, it was once also the location of a fairly brutal shark attack. In 1992, Chief Resident Scientist Mike Fraser was mauled by a 4-meter white shark while snorkeling in the waters surrounding Campbell Island. Waters that at the time were clocked at an icy 7 degrees Celsius. Wait, hang on a minute. 7 degrees Celsius? That right there is well out of the known temperature range for great white sharks, which is thought to be somewhere between 12 and 24 degrees Celsius. It's 5 degrees lower than their known range, which is a big difference. And I've said on the channel before that I don't really think white sharks are found in the UK for most of the year anyway, because it's probably a bit too cold. But based on this specific incident on Campbell Island, was I actually wrong? Well, today we're going to have a look into this icy white shark attack. We'll explore the movements of white sharks in this chilly corner of the world, and we'll figure out once and for all whether white sharks really can survive or even thrive in the subantarctic Ocean. Welcome back to another Shark Bytes episode, everyone. Now, back in the 1990s, scientists presumed that white sharks were a coastal temperate species and were never found in waters below around 10 degrees Celsius. It was thought that it was just too cold for them to be able to survive. And that's what Mike Fraser thought right before he found his arm inside the mouth of one of these sharks on Campbell Island in April 1992. The day of the incident, by all accounts, started off fairly pleasant. Mike and his team of meteorologists had decided to reward themselves for their 5 months of hard work by having the afternoon off to go snorkeling. So they trekked about an hour and a half from their base towards Middle Bay on the western side of the island. The team didn't really get regular opportunities to have time off together, so they were all pretty excited to head into the water with the chance of maybe snorkeling with sea lions who regularly frequented the beach nearby. In the coming weeks as well, the team hoped to swim with southern right whales from that very same spot. These whales migrate north at the end of April every year with their calves from Antarctica, heading towards the tropics, and would always pit stop at Campbell Island. On this particular day though, before heading into the water, the team noticed that there wasn't actually much wildlife around. The New Zealand sea lions that would usually be seen on the beach or frolicking around in the bay had disappeared. But regardless of this, they donned their snorkel gear, wetsuits and hoods and headed into the chilly water that had been recorded earlier that day at 7 degrees Celsius. As they headed out into the water, they noticed there was a pretty steep drop off about 20 meters from shore, so for fun they decided to challenge themselves to see if they could get to the bottom. Mike decided instead that he wanted to explore the bay a little bit more and scope out some of the areas where they might be able to see the southern right whales in a few weeks' time. So he headed off out further into the bay and into deeper waters. After a few minutes of snorkeling, Mike was hit hard by something on his side, so hard it knocked his mask from his face and pulled him underwater. He initially thought it was an adult bull sea lion that had bashed into him, but as he was burst to the surface of the water, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The unmistakable eye and face of a white shark was looking right back at him, and alarmingly, its jaws were clamped down on Mike's right arm. Mike's colleagues closer to shore heard the commotion and looked over to see him wrestling at the surface with the shark, of which completely dwarfed him. They estimated it to be about 4.5 meters long. Meanwhile, Mike did what everyone should do in that grave situation and decided to fight back, kicking at the shark with his feet and punching it with his left arm. And with one big push of his knees, his arm pulled from the shark's mouth and it swam off. He started floating at the surface of the water, and instead of fearing that the shark would come back, he actually was frightened that he was going to drown instead. 20 meters closer to shore, in a state of pure fear, 3 of Mike's colleagues had swum back to the beach, but one of them had stayed in the water. Jacinda Amy, a scientist who came to the island to study the resident penguin colony, decided that she couldn't leave Mike out there on his own. And without thinking, she courageously swam as fast as she could out towards him and started to tow him back to shore. An act that would later earn her the New Zealand Cross, the country's highest award for bravery. It turned out Mike's right arm had been severed below the elbow and his left was lacerated and likely broken. As Jacinda swam him to shore, she was trying to keep Mike from looking at his arm, but he whispered to her, "I've seen it. I know it's gone. By the time they got back, the rest of the team had sprung into action, getting the first aid kit and making an improvised tourniquet out of a dive mask strap. But the situation before them was pretty dire. Mike had lost a lot of blood and was freezing cold, although the team began to realize the problem was even worse. Campbell Island is one of the most remote islands in the region, 36 hours by boat to the nearest island, and unsuitable terrain for an emergency aeroplane to land. Mike's colleagues initially tried to get him back to their base, which was an hour and a half away, but as they stretchered him, his pain began to set in, and they realized they just weren't going to be able to move him. Instead, they decided to bring the camp to him, hauling supplies from the other side of the island and creating a tent around him. Meanwhile, another team member had radioed for emergency assistance, and the emergency protocol for that island was for a helicopter evacuation. At the time, a helicopter journey this long had never been attempted in New Zealand before, maybe even the world. And because it hadn't been done before, the helicopter pilot and the paramedic had to modify the actual helicopter to make sure they could stay in the air for that long, and they even had to refuel it mid-air. Anyway, after a grueling 15 hours, they managed to reach Mike, who'd lost half his blood, and once he was in a stable condition, they transported him 430 miles away to the nearest hospital. Miraculously, somehow Mike managed to survive the ordeal, and even returned to the island 4 years later to complete his stint as a meteorologist there. What an unbelievable story that is. I just can't believe he managed to survive that. Because when you hear about these severe shark attacks that happen in remote places, when you're that far away from medical attention, your chances of surviving it are so slim. Now, of all the places in the world, New Zealand does boast a half-decent population of white sharks. As of 2024, there's estimated to be just under 1,000 sexually mature adult individuals that frequent the waters around New Zealand. The two main hotspots for white sharks are Stewart Island, just off the southern tip of the South Island, and then the Chatham Islands, which sit about 500 miles east from the North Island. The white sharks in these two areas these days have been extensively tagged, showing migration movements up towards Tonga, and then also return migrations to and from the east coast of Australia. It's also now well documented that the white sharks in this part of the world will follow the movements of various different whale species as they move up with their calves from Antarctic waters towards the tropics. Now, despite the vast majority of tracked white sharks in New Zealand usually choosing to head north or northwest, we now know that the occasional individual will head south towards colder waters. But how is it that they're able to deal with that ever-decreasing sea temperature as they move further south? Well, white sharks are in the Lamnidae family of sharks. These are your mackerel sharks like porbeagles, makos, and salmon sharks. But this particular group of sharks, including the white shark, have all evolved a specialized system that allows them to deal with cooler water temperatures. The rete mirabile, which literally translates to wonderful net, is a network of arteries and veins that are really close together, and it allows these specific sharks to generate heat from swimming. Importantly here, it enables them to maintain an internal body temperature up to 14 degrees higher than the surrounding water. And the payoff of having this system is enormous. They can swim faster for longer, they can increase their digestion speed, which means they get more energy from the food they eat, and vitally here, they can expand their range into colder, more nutrient-rich waters. So it's this counter-current heat exchange system in their bodies that means it's possible for them to survive in these colder water temperatures, perhaps even as low as 7 degrees Celsius, like it was that day on Campbell Island. But it comes at a cost. When a human jumps into an icy pool, our blood flow is diverted to our vital organs, like the heart and the brain. It's why your lips end up going blue or your fingertips turn white. But what's also happening alongside this is that our bodies are metabolizing at a much faster rate, converting food or body fat into usable energy. And it's exactly the same for these lamnid sharks. In colder water, they're burning through energy like a steam train engine. When they're in this cold water, they've got to eat more high-quality calorific food to be able to sustain themselves, sometimes up to 10 times more. And so these white sharks that head south from New Zealand into subantarctic waters aren't doing it for fun. Their movements here are almost always intrinsically linked to their food. And so it would seem that the Campbell Island white shark and Mike Fraser might have actually both been looking for the same thing on that day in April 1992. Southern right whales or big adult sea lions. These two prey items are of the exact high calorific value that the white shark needs to survive in those water temperatures. On that day, it was still a bit too early for the southern right whales, but the team of meteorologists also noted there were no sea lions in the area. Perhaps they caught wind of that shark and moved off elsewhere. So instead, that shark has decided to have a go at the nearest thing that it could find that it thought might have been food. Mike Frazier. Interestingly here, we know that the shark didn't come back to have another go at Mike after he had fought it off. We of course can't know whether it was the presence of Jacinda coming to Mike's aid, or whether the shark was extra sensitive and aware that the thing that it bit down on wasn't that high quality calorific meal that it needed, and it would have been more hassle than it was worth, so it just swam off. I think either of those two things are plausible here. This particular incident though shows us that these sharks can and will go into water temperatures considerably colder than their reported tolerable range. Back in the 1990s, we just didn't have the information available to us to prove that. But with satellite tags now playing a huge role in how we monitor these animals, we can see that they will go to colder areas where there's no one there to observe them. At least provided there's enough food there for them to be able to offset that cost. It does beg the question though, how far south can they go? To my knowledge anyway, the furthest south a white shark has been tracked in this region of the world is about 200 miles south of Campbell Island, sitting somewhere between Campbell and Macquarie Island. And from there, it's probably only another 300 miles or so until you break into the Antarctic Circle. I don't think we'll be seeing any white shark tracks into the Antarctic Ocean though for a good few more years yet. But I suppose with the Antarctic warming at faster rates than anywhere else in the world, you never know. So, was I wrong about white sharks being found or not found in the cooler water temperatures of the UK? Perhaps from a temperature perspective, yeah, I might have been a bit wrong. They may be able to venture into these waters outside of those summer months. Although if I remember correctly, I don't think temperature was my main sticking point. It was food. Down here in the southwest, I don't think we have enough seals to be able to maintain or sustain a population of white sharks. But in Scotland, there is enough seals up there, and it looks to be about the right temperature for large portions of the year. And this might explain why perhaps some of the strongest claims for white sharks in UK waters seem to cluster around Scotland. And some of those sightings I talked to you about in this video right here. There's two particular incidents in this video, both from Scotland, that are really hard to argue against. Someone even managed to get a photograph of one of them, so make sure you give it a watch.